Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into the raw math behind one of the most jaw-dropping real estate exits in New York City history. We're looking at a massive financial move by a tech billionaire that most people completely missed. And we're going to break down exactly what it signals for the future of housing, politics, and the broader economy in America's largest city. So let's get right into it.
Imagine, just for a second, handing over a $100 bill for what is traditionally considered one of the absolute safest asset classes on the planet and voluntarily walking away with just 6 pennies. No meme stocks, no wild tech startups. We're talking New York City real estate. Today, we're going to explore exactly why one of the world's richest men did exactly that, and why he didn't fight it, didn't sue, but simply took a staggering loss and walked out the door. Part 1, a billionaire's shocking loss. Let's look at the actual facts here, because when we peel back the layers of the official corporate statements, the financial reality reveals an almost unprecedented shift in the market. The sheer scale is just wild. Back in December, an entity called Amphitheater LLC, which is tied directly to Google co-founder Sergey Brin, dumped its massive stake in a real estate fund back to the manager A&E Real Estate. We aren't talking about a few duplexes. This is nearly 6,000 apartments spread across Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx. Brin's original equity investment was valued at roughly $79 million, and he sold it for just 6 cents on the dollar. The fund manager, A&E, put out a statement confirming the buyout without naming Brin directly. They noted that a long-term investor was willing to accept 6 cents on the dollar on their original equity investment to divest itself from the New York City multifamily sector. You know, corporate phrasing is always so polite, right? But divesting at a 94% loss, that basically means doing whatever it literally takes to just get out. It's the financial equivalent of pulling the ripcord and abandoning the parachute.
Part 2, the math behind the exit.
So the crucial question here is why? To understand why a guy worth over $260 billion would just swallow a massive loss like this without a fight, you gotta understand how he views the world. Sergey Brin is not your typical old-school real estate landlord. He was born in Moscow to a mathematician father who faced heavy discrimination. His family fled to the U.S. with almost nothing. He grew up, earned a Stanford PhD, and literally co-engineered the search algorithm that built Google. The takeaway? Brin evaluates systems using pure math. He looks at the raw data to see if a system will scale or if it's just going to collapse under its own weight. And when he evaluated this specific investment, he saw a totally unsolvable equation. On the burden side, massive. A&E reported that operating costs jumped 78% over the last decade. They're carrying $84 million in unpaid rent, and they've already sunk $800 million into capital improvements. But over on the revenue side, the allowed rent increases were locked at 0. Look, when your costs skyrocket by nearly 80% and your revenue is capped at 0 forever, any engineer will tell you that system is fundamentally broken.
And hey, the math is already failing in real time. Wells Fargo, acting as a trustee on the fund's debt, has actually already kicked off foreclosure proceedings on a $56 million loan tied to these exact buildings. So this isn't some theoretical collapse years down the road. The dominoes are actively falling right now. Part 3, the political battleground.
Now, this financial crunch didn't just happen out of nowhere. It collided perfectly with a massive shift in the city's political landscape. Delivering on a major campaign promise, Mayor Zoran Mamdani and his newly appointed board members made a really decisive move. The Rent Guidelines Board voted 7-1 to cap rent increases at 0% for stabilized leases all the way through September of 2027. So from a strictly mathematical perspective, this effectively stripped away the single lever landlords had to match those rapidly surging operational costs we just talked about.
The political environment surrounding this policy also got incredibly targeted. The mayor explicitly called out A&E Real Estate by name, accusing them of exhibiting overt cruelty toward its tenants. On top of that, the city's public advocate officially labeled A&E executives as among the 2 worst landlords in the entire city out of thousands of property owners. Now, wherever you happen to stand on the politics here, if you're an investor reading the board, all of this loudly signals that the environment is actively hostile toward the fund managing your money.
Part 4, the tenant's dilemma.
Okay, let's step away from the billionaires and the politicians for a second. What does this broken financial and political equation mean for the actual people living inside these apartments? Let's imagine a hypothetical tenant. We'll call her Linda, just to ground this in reality. Linda has lived in her rent-stabilized Bronx apartment for 18 years. On paper, she gets a frozen monthly bill, which is obviously a huge relief for her wallet. But in reality,
She's stuck living with a broken boiler in the dead of winter, and the hallway lights are constantly flickering, all because the company managing her building is bleeding cash and staring down foreclosure.
It's this really harsh paradox. The rent freeze absolutely protected Linda's monthly rent number, but it completely failed to protect the physical building she lives in. With zero path to ever recover costs and huge investors like Sergey Brin just bailing, the actual capital required to fix basic stuff, like Linda's heat, well, it literally just doesn't exist anymore.
Part 5. The Real Estate Doom Loop.
Because here's the thing. Linda's freezing apartment isn't just an isolated incident of bad management. It's the very first warning sign of a much wider macroeconomic collapse. It triggers what an A&E representative pretty accurately called a doom loop. It's a sequential death spiral. Step 1, major investors like Bren walk away. Step 2, lenders see that panic and tighten their loan terms across the whole sector. Step 3, capital for repairs entirely dries up. Step 4, the buildings themselves physically deteriorate. Step 5, the city issues violations and fines, which drains whatever tiny bit of cash the landlord had left. And finally, Step 6, the owners literally just abandon the properties because they absolutely cannot make the math work. And if that sounds like some apocalyptic movie script, it's actually historical fact. New York City has lived through this exact mathematical failure before. Back in the 1970s, facing similar massive rent and cost pressures, landlords just couldn't balance the books. The end result was widespread property abandonment, famously culminating in massive swaths of housing in the South Bronx effectively burning to the ground. History tells us exactly how this loop ends. In this housing crisis is happening exactly when the city's own financial warning lights are flashing bright red. In this wild coincidence of numbers, New York City's own operating surplus recently collapsed by 94% in a single year. That is the exact same percentage loss that Brin took on his real estate exit. The financial cushion is basically evaporating across the board. To make matters worse, Moody's recently downgraded the city's credit outlook from stable to negative. They're pointing to persistent budget gaps and a looming, massive deficit projected at north of $7 billion over the next 2 years. The city is bleeding money just as fast as the landlords are. So how do these two crises actually connect? Here's the really uncomfortable math that ties the whole thing together. City Hall relies heavily on property tax revenue to fund its budget, to pay for its services, and frankly, just to survive. But those property taxes depend entirely on these buildings holding their value. And the buildings only hold value if investors actually believe they can operate them profitably. If the buildings become financially worthless, the city's tax revenue evaporates right along with them. And that belief in profitability, yeah, it's gone. An A&E representative bluntly stated that institutional capital, meaning both equity investors and the lenders, is fleeing the city's rent-stabilized apartment sector. Look, when a billionaire who evaluates the entire world through pure math decides that eating a 94% loss is his safest bet, it loudly and clearly signals that institutional confidence in the city's real estate value has completely cratered. Which leaves us with a critical and, frankly, super unsettling question to consider as we wrap up this explainer. Sergey Brin made headlines because of who he is. But is his 6-cent exit just an isolated case of one billionaire's self-interest? Or is he the canary in the coal mine? If the smartest, most data-driven money in the world has already run the numbers and decided to pack up and leave, how much of the system has already collapsed quietly behind the scenes without ever making the evening news? Thanks for learning with us today, and definitely keep questioning the math behind the headlines.